All right, so in this video, we'll be looking at this idea of species concepts. There are different ways to define a species. We looked at that a little bit in 2.1, but in this one, we'll be looking at some different views of how a species is defined. So the first species concept is called a typological species concept. So it's kind of like if you think of a bear in your head, or a snake, or a spider, or a donkey. There is a thing that comes to your head, right? And so you know that when you see an animal out in the wild, or you see an animal wherever, you might think that's a bear because you have a type of bear in your head, or a type of spider. You know, spiders generally look a certain way, or snakes generally look a certain way. And so this typological species concept is that idea. There's like an ideal form of a species, and your mind and our ideas of that form kind of conform to this common denominator. When you see an eight-legged thing, you think spider. Not all eight-legged things are spiders. Um, and so you can see that this is not a very good categorization. It's still used as a general basis of understanding. You know, if we see something we've never seen before, it kind of leads us in a certain direction, but it's not a very precise way of doing speciation. The biological species concept is the one that we have talked about already. This is the idea that a species is a reproductive community of populations that are reproductively isolated, meaning that look at these frogs. Maybe the frogs on one side of the road are reproducing together, but aren't reproducing with the frogs on the other side of the road. And so the idea is that these are reproductively isolated from one another and will eventually become a separate kind of species on down the road and have completely different traits altogether. You do have there, you know, if those two populations are interbreeding with one another, then you would call them the same species. But if there are barriers that prevent reproduction, then the idea is that would eventually they would just become two separate species, and so biologically distinct, that they wouldn't be able to breed with one another. A couple of other ideas here. Generally, these species will share the same niche with one another. There are some ideas, or there are some kind of gray areas with this. This idea of a sibling species. We are so stuck on this idea that things that look the same are the same, and things that look different are different. I know that sounds all weird, but so this is an example of a sibling species where these three different species look very similar to one another, but they're actually separate species. They're not interbreeding populations. And so even though they are morphologically identical, they are reproductively isolated from one another. And that's what we would call a sibling species. The problem with this definition is that it's difficult to trace from an evolutionary standpoint. And then there's also disagreements as to what reproductively isolated means. You know, and is a population truly reproductively isolated? And it also just completely discounts asexual reproduction as well, because it kind of assumes that there's going to be sexual reproduction. So there are other ways to account for those. This is another picture of some sibling species. I'm not sure what those birds are. Not sure what the frogs are either. I think the frog in the upper right is a frog that's native to Kentucky, but the frog in the lower right is not. But I'm not sure what these are. But these are pictures of sibling species also. All right, so evolutionary species concept is the idea that there's a single lineage of ancestor-descendant populations, and they kind of maintain this unified identity throughout. The problem with this is it only shows this single line. So here you have, what is thought to be the ancestor to whales, and then you have this more aquatic, and then slowly reaching more into this aquatic area here, and then you have a species that eventually loses its hind legs because it's just not as efficient to have hind legs if you're going to be a really good swimmer. And so this shows just a single lineage. It doesn't account for other animals that could have been in the same lineage. It doesn't account for other species that could have gone extinct or anything like that. This is just a single lineage and doesn't tell a full story. You can have an asexually reproducing organism in this kind of concept, but there's a better way to look at this, and that is what we see with this next one, with the phylogenetic species concept. And we move myself again. All right. So phylogenetic species concept gives you a broader range of things. You have these groupings that you can see come from other groupings, and it shows more of a broader kind of ancestry. You see an ancestral pattern throughout history, strongly represents common descent. So, here you have a carnivores coming out, and you can see the common ancestor between wolves and panthers, but you see these other trains along the way. And so the common ancestor between wolves and panthers is way back here, whereas the common ancestor between wolves and this particular group, which is like weasels and badgers and that sort of thing, is more recent. And so it shows you a lot more information. You can see small changes in isolated populations as well. This is a picture of human populations here. You can kind of see way back here is a common ancestor between like Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, which are kind of the ones that we think of as far as the nearest population of the genus Homo that has been alive. And we hear about Neanderthal all the time. Well, they reproductively isolate themselves a long time ago, and we didn't really meet them until Homo sapiens expanded into Europe and kind of competed with Neanderthal. And so you get the idea. This just shows you a broader sort of idea with that species concept. And next, just some ideas here, how this works today. This idea of DNA barcoding. This is used to identify species almost exclusively now, though in the field you will look and you can see phenotypic differences. When it comes to the brass tacks, there's going to be some sort of DNA analysis in order to type species and see what the difference between them is. One of the DNA markers that is often used is this protein, which is called Cytochrome C. Cytochrome C is a protein that is found in all living things, and it is something that is, you can find differences in the cytochrome C amino acids and cytochrome C DNA patterns that will show one species to be different from another.